welcome to this session of the Young China Watchers, China's Borderlands series. The purpose of this series, and YCW more generally, is to talk about China. And this particular series of webinars is one that we started a little while ago. And our idea is to try to explore China's borderland relations. China shares borders with, I think it's 14 different countries, and we're talking about land borders here, not to the seas. And it's a very interesting set of relationships. And these relationships are ones that, on the one hand, are, very personal, human to human. You've got sort of communities and tribes that live back and forth across these borders, but they have wider geopolitical consequences as well. And so the purpose of this webinar series is to try to dig in to this series and to try to understand better how these relationships actually exist, how they're structured, and to try to dig into China's wide range of borderland relations. Now, we've already done a couple of webinars within this series, which you can find on the Young China Watchers YouTube channel. The first one was with the academic M. Taylor Fravel, which was kind of an overview of the entire thing. And then we did a session on Afghanistan with Tamim Maseh, who's a former defense minister of Afghanistan, former deputy defense minister of Afghanistan. And we're delighted today to be joined by Ananth Krishnan, who is the Hindu, which is an Indian newspaper's correspondent in Beijing, which is where he's joining us from. And unfortunately, technical capabilities from Beijing are a bit complicated. And so unfortunately, he's only going to be able to join us via audio. But before I fully introduce Ananth and start off this session, I'll just briefly introduce Young China Watchers. So those of you who don't know it, Young China Watchers is a global network of China-interested young people. I mean, what defines young? Well, that's very much in the eye of the individual. But we're an organization that was founded back in 2010 in Beijing, actually, and has now grown to 10 chapters around the world. We have a global leadership at the moment that's based in London, in Washington, and in Berlin, and also has chapters out here in Asia. Its website is youngchinawatchers.com. We have a number of events and chapters that are run out of our various chapters around the world. We do a number of other activities. We have an annual conference that's held in London. We do smaller events in other cities. We have essay competitions. We have an annual pulse survey, which tries to get a sense of what the kind of global community is thinking. And basically, the idea is to try to encourage a richer conversation around China than the sometimes polarized debate that one can find in the public discourse. And so as part of this Borderland series, as I said, we thought what we're trying to do is identify speakers who really know about China and understand kind of China's relations with their country, really from the ground up, and try to get into some detail of understanding what is actually going on and how maybe the sort of borderland relations themselves between these countries shape the wider geopolitical relationship. And to do that today, we're delighted to be touching on India, as I said, with Ananth Krishnan, who is a widely published academic and author. He's previously been an academic working at Brookings in India, where I think he is still actually associate or visiting fellow, but I'm sure he will correct me of that. Previously, he was the China bureau chief and associate editor for the India Today group. He also worked for the Hindu newspaper before that, reporting in India. And currently, as I said, he is the Hindu's correspondent in Beijing. He's also the author of a book that I would highly recommend on the subject of China and India's relations, which is India, China's Challenge, which was published a little bit ago, but is a really excellent snapshot of the kind of relationship. And so today, Ananth is going to talk us through a little bit about their book and the kind of wider geopolitics, which is incredibly relevant as we come up to a moment when, we're going to probably see Presidents Xi and Modi meeting in Samarkand. But before we get into that, Ananth, thank you so much for taking the time to join us for the next of this series. And maybe I'll start, if I can, with quite a sort of broad question. But maybe could you talk us through India's direct borderland relations with China? And maybe first talk us through, if you can describe them a little bit to us. I mean, I think if people have heard about them, they've heard about the conflicts. But I think if you could talk us through a little bit of detail, what those borderlands actually look like, maybe both in terms of where the lines are defined, but also the communities that exist there. Please, Ananth, over to you.
First of all, thank you so much, Raf and Young China Watchers, for having me. I hope you can hear me, Raf. It's been a bit of a nightmare today and yesterday. with VPNs. I think most of your audience is familiar with this part of life in China, especially 1 month before the Party Congress. Things have been a bit haywire the last 48, 72 hours. In terms of the borderlands of India and China, which I've had the pleasure of visiting on both sides, the unfortunate thing is because of the boundary dispute and the fact that they're so militarized and at this moment in crisis, you really don't have that much of interactions in terms of whether it's trade, which you had historically, but not now, or whether in terms of how communities on both sides interact, that really isn't there. Also because it's a very desolate place, especially in the Ladakh and Tibet side of it, in the western section of the border. And especially most of you will also be aware we're in the middle of a crisis right now, where you have 100,000 soldiers deployed in forward areas. So in that kind of climate, it's very difficult to look at the boundary at the moment beyond the sort of military dimension.
So I wonder, Ananth, could you describe to us a little bit more, kind of, because there's a number of places where there's kind of a contentious border that's ill-defined. And could you talk us through a little bit of the history of that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. It would take, I think, hours for us to get into.
Yes, books have been written on this, I know, but I'm sure you can do it in a wonderfully succinct way.
And none of the books agree, of course, on the origins of the dispute. But to put it very briefly, the genesis lies in the fact that when India became independent in 1947 and the PRC was founded in 1949, they inherited unsettled borders. And in a very sort of strange irony, despite all the talk of them decolonizing, they inherited imperial borders. For India, it was the British empires, and for China, it was the Qing borders. And these new states kind of, what they did was they emphasized maximalist claims derived from those imperial borders. So obviously, you had the perfect sort of recipe for a boundary dispute. And these new states had to negotiate borders from scratch. And in the cases of India and China, it was entangled in very complicated colonial histories. And add in the Tibet question, because China's claims, especially in Arunachal Pradesh in the east, are derived from China's claims that Tibet was always a part of China, which is problematic to say the least. So it's really tied up in questions of the imperial past in terms of Tibet. And that's what makes it so difficult to resolve. And I think that's why they've made so little progress in actually settling it. And I think the thing that most people don't really understand is even though the heart of the dispute is China's claims to Arunachal Pradesh in the east and India's claims to Aksai Chin in the west, what they've been fighting about is actually not territory, alignment of what they call the line of actual control. And that's what this is about. So essentially, you have two big claims, as well as a completely undemarcated border that has never been delineated or demarcated, which is why it still remains such a central issue in India-China relations. And I think it's the dominant issue in India-China relations even today.
So, I wonder if, you touched on this very briefly when you talked about the kind of Tibetan questions and the sort of tensions that exist there. And of course, one large part of the tensions that is, stem from that is, China's claim to that territory and the Tibetan people, but also the fact that there are Tibetan communities in India. I think the sort of the law Dharamsala, I think, is a sort of haven for a lot of the, Tibetan community that opposes sort of Chinese rule. Now, I know you mentioned before that it's generally a very desolate place, these borderland regions. I wonder, are there any other communities that kind of exist across these borders? Because that's something that's very true of a lot of China's other sort of shared borders, that they do have these kind of cross-border communities. Is that just not true in the India context?
You do have, for instance, in Nathula, in Sikkim, in the Sikkim-Tibet border, you had trading that's gone on even in the good times of India-China relations. And in a lot of the other sections in Ladakh, you have grazers who go across from one side to another, and that's actually become strategic as well, where you have allegations of, say, the PLA sending in grazers to assert their claims and they allege that India does the same. But you've had trading going on in some of the mountain passes. Natula is a great example of that. And you've also even had religious exchanges, which I should point out, Raf, in terms of Indian pilgrims who've crossed over to visit Mount Kailash in Tibet. But it is very limited. If you look at the entire sort of geography of the border, I'd say these are isolated.
Okay, so there's sort of quite a limited contact, but there is some sort of a contact there. Let me just add to our audience, if you do have any questions you'd like to put to Ananth, please feel free to plug them into the Q&A function, and I'll pick them up and put them to him. And feel free to do that at any point, and I will bring them into the conversation as we sort of go along. So please feel free to add your questions in when you'd like to, when they sort of come to your mind. If we then take this forwards, and you mentioned that the borders continue to be a sort of enduring issue in the relations, and we're seeing now, we've got President Modi and Xi who are about to meet potentially in Samarkand, and it seems to be in the sort of prelude to this session, talk of the borders seems to be coming up again. I think there's been even some talk of some disengagement from the last standoff that we've had, and this seems to be suggesting that we're edging towards some sort of resolution. But I feel like we've heard this before, so I wonder if you could kind of put that into its proper context. What are we expecting to happen this week, and how does that fit with the sort of border clashes and subsequent discussions we've had in recent times?
I think you're absolutely right in that we've heard this before. And I think that I wouldn't put too much into the latest disengagement. I think it's just part of this cycle that you have of crisis followed by crisis management and temporary arrangements. We're nowhere near any kind of sort of permanent resolution or permanent understanding. In fact, I think, Raf, at this point, a lot of the past agreements have been left in the dustbin from what the PLA did in April 2020. So you're literally at square one right now, and Modi and Xi may or may not be meeting. You're at square one in terms of boundary management. I think a lot of hard work of the last 20, 30 years has been sort of relegated to history because of how China is dealing with all of its frontiers. I think it's a part of a pattern where it feels that given the power it has at the moment, it doesn't have to be beholden to agreements that it committed to 20, 30 years ago. So I think you're at a very uncertain time right now, where I think that both India and China don't quite know how they're going to manage the boundary going forward. And I think it's a worrying time right now. And even though you've had this disengagement, I remain as concerned as I was 2 years ago when you had bloodshed at Galwan Valley, because of the fact that even if they've disengaged from a face-off site, there's no talk of de-escalation. And everything I see and read in Beijing to me suggests the focus of the PLA right now is to improve its forward permanent deployments. And that's why there's lots of infrastructure being built. And I think that for whatever reason, we don't quite know, I think China is seeing a fundamentally different way of managing the line of actual control with India, which will mean a permanent presence closer to the LAC than we've had in the last 40, 50 years. So I still think that the way I look at it, even though it's a temporary sort of piece, I think the structural sort of factors and how the border is being managed mean that the next 5, 10 years, you're going to see a lot more tension and a lot more unpredictability in how India and China manage it.
Do you think there's a desire on either side to actually resolve this question, or do you think it's useful to have a kind of point of tension with each other? Because of course, to put it in the bigger picture, these are the two big Asian giants, right? The two big rising Asian giants. And is it useful to them to have some sort of a clash where they can always prod at each other? Do you think there is a genuine desire in either New Delhi or Beijing to actually resolve this, or maybe in one and not the other?
I think sadly not. I think in my book, I naively kind of make a case for why settling it on a as is, where is basis is something that is the most sort of logical thing. But I think it's impossible for India and China for different reasons. I think for China, they are concerned about, say, India-US relations, and I think they see it as leverage. And their sort of thinking is, why should they give up this kind of leverage if they get nothing in return? I heard it sort of phrased very sort of well by a Chinese scholar who said the primary difference is India looks at a border resolution as the means to a better relationship, but China looks at it as a consequence of an improved relationship. So I think those are very fundamentally different ways in how they look at it, where India feels unless you settle this, we can never reach a certain level of closeness with China. But the Chinese feel, well, if you don't sort of improve relations, why should they take the step of giving up this leverage? So that's why it's kind of stalemated in how even they strategically look at it, not just how they look at it in terms of territorial claims. It's more than the territorial claims. I think there's a very sort of fundamental strategic difference in how they look at the boundary, which is why I don't expect anyone to sort of move towards even thinking or discussing a resolution.
Very, very interesting. I mean, we've had a question in already, which actually is quite relevant to what you were just talking about. So I'm going to pick it up quickly before we sort of move on to other subjects. And let me also encourage anyone in the audience who does want to ask any questions, please put it into the Q&A function. So you made a comment in your last discussion, in your last comments about China having a general pattern of behavior to its kind of borderland relations at the moment, and you know how this one with India that we're seeing a sort of greater desire for tension was part of a wider picture and wasn't just sort of focused on them. And I wonder, and the question is, what parallel would you draw between the Sino-Indian border dispute and the South China Sea? And if I can maybe extend that question further and say, do you see any similarity to some of other China's land borders as well?
I think the China-Russia land border is a bit of an exception, and I actually had the pleasure of going up to Manjoli, and I was, as an Indian, you're kind of really sort of left wondering what if, where you see like a little fence and you see sheep sort of grazing on the Chinese side and hopping over the fence and going into the Russian side. And you see Russians coming in without visas. And to me, I mean, obviously it's something I would want to see between India and China, make no mistake. But I think now it's kind of an exception. And especially, I think after Xi Jinping took over, I wouldn't put everything on Xi Jinping's head. I think there were broader trends leading up to that, whether or not he took office, where I think there's an emphasis more in terms of how China looks at borders as a question of national sovereignty and core interests. Rather than issues that can be managed jointly with other countries. And I think that's a fundamental change in how they've looked at it. Even I see that in how they discuss it with India, where I think from the late 80s, throughout the 90s, and even early 2000s, I think it was a joint effort to maintain peace. It was where you had India and China discuss border arrangements, confidence building measures, and the like. And I never used to see it being framed solely from the point of view of sovereignty. And I think in the last few years, I've seen that in the Chinese media in terms of even how the PLA describes its border disputes. Not an inch of land can be lost is the kind of defining phrase, how they speak about the border with India at the moment. And I think the fact that they phrased it that way really reduces the scope for both sides to really sit down and talk about it. Just as an aside, I recently went to the military museum in Beijing, where there's this big exhibit going on for the PLA's anniversary. And they have this huge section on the India border, and they have stones from the Karakoram Mountains. And so visitors can sort of press a button to express their support for the military and saying that they do their part to guard every inch. So it's become like a kind of, I think when you put it in the public realm in that kind of way, it kind of changes how you look at it, rather than something that's to be resolved, but more as something that is to be protected by China.
Fascinating. So I guess that's the parallel you draw with the South China Sea as well, or is there something? Are there any others?
Absolutely. I think you see that in terms of all of their. I think you see that pattern played out in the South China Sea as well, where you've seen them dragging their feet in discussing a code of conduct. I mean, they've been speaking about that for such a long time. But the way I see it, even that's phrased so dominantly from a question of national sovereignty, that I find it very difficult to imagine them making meaningful concessions. And of course, any progress, whether on the India frontier or whether in the South China Sea, requires all sides to make concessions. But when you frame it in this way, you just make it very difficult even within China domestically for the leadership to think of meaningful concessions.
Can I ask you, on the sort of Indian side, has their perspective changed? Because we've had these sort of series of clashes over the past few years at various points along these borders, escalating to the incident in Galwan, which led to many deaths. I don't know, maybe you have a precise figure of what happened there, but what's your understanding of how things are shifting on the Indian side about these sorts of thoughts and about these borderland regions?
I can't stress enough how significant a change I've seen in the Indian side, not just Indian government, but Indian industry, even like young Indians, Indian students, in how they look at China post 2020. I think in the phase from normalization of ties until 2020, there was this sense that you have differences, but you can try and work together, cooperate, and compete at the same time. But I'd say that's fundamentally shifted after the border clash, where the whole sort of balance of cooperation and competition or confrontation with China shifted drastically, I think, in the eyes of most people in India, where they just see very little space of a meeting of minds with China. And I'd say it's because of the boundary clash and the deaths that you've had have changed the way people have looked at it. And I can't stress that enough, even in terms of Indian businesses who saw China as a big opportunity. But I think that's less and less the case right now. And I think the boundary has come back as a central theme in the relationship, I'd say for the first time since the 1960s. So it's a huge change, and it's a sea change. And I think that we're at the start of a new phase in the relationship. I'm not quite sure how it's going to go, but I think I find it very difficult to see them de-emphasize the boundary. And I think the kind of golden period where they were able to do that against all odds for 25, 30 years, which I think was a great achievement to prevent bloodshed for so long when you don't have an agreed upon line. I think that's now all kind of out of the window at the moment.
I mean, you mentioned the 1960s, of course, that was when there was a war between the two countries. Do you see this escalating up as far as that now? Or do you think are there still voices on both sides that want to try to keep it below that kind of threshold?
I'd say that I think neither side, of course, wants a war or a confrontation or a conflict. But the thing that scares me is that I don't think I can tell you with a high degree of confidence that you can rule out the possibility of a clash, because of the fact that I think because of China's actions and their desire to have the LAC militarized and their desire to have permanent forward deployments, I think they've raised the risk factor by an enormous degree in the last 2 years. And I still don't have an answer for you why they would want to do that. Because the chance of an incident, Galwan Valley, I don't think either side wanted a massive clash in Galwan Valley and bloodshed. I think it was one of those things that escalated out of control. And it was because of China reneging on a disengagement sort of agreement and not withdrawing their tent in a disputed sort of section of the river. But because of that kind of attitude to the boundary, and because of the fact that they've turned their back on previous confidence building measures, I think they've raised the risk of a clash to a huge degree that I don't think I can say with any confidence that it's out of the question that there would be a clash between India and China in the next year or two. I can't say that. That's something I wouldn't have told you if you asked me 2-3 years ago. I would have said that no way. I think that there's a very sort of well-defined, codified set of rules governing behavior of both sides. But I think it's an extremely dangerous thing when all those arrangements have kind of been disregarded. You're in a completely new situation at the moment, and they're kind of sort of winging it as they go along at every different point on the LAC. They're coming up with specific arrangements. So I think it's still a huge degree of uncertainty right now in border management between India and China, and that should worry everyone.
That's quite worrying perspectives you put out. And actually, I just see a questions come in, which I'll maybe pick up in a minute. But I did want to pick up on something slightly adjacent. Of course, in any discussion around China, India, it's very rapidly Pakistan usually appears within the conversation. And there is, of course, a part of Kashmir, which is, kind of divided between the three of them and is, no one quite recognizes each other's things. I wonder, is that an area which has sort of played into this wider confrontation? Do you think that could become a focus? Or do you think sort of Pakistan in general is tangential to this entire discussion, which is really sort of bilateral one between India and China?
No, I think that it's definitely increasingly becoming a very important part of the India-China boundary issue. And I think that in 2013, when China launched the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, what they essentially did was they, I think, made a very significant change from their past approach of generally not interfering in the Kashmir dispute. Even though they officially say they don't take sides in it, by launching CPEC, what they've essentially done is de facto recognized what India calls as Pakistan-occupied Kashmir as a part of Pakistan. Since they have Chinese personnel on the ground there, they have projects there. They've been isolated reports of joint China-Pakistan patrols on the POK Xinjiang border. So I think in the last 8-9 years, they've de facto recognized this section of Kashmir as belonging to Pakistan, even if they won't say that out loud. So I think that for India, why this matters is I think the likelihood of a two-front situation is, I think, more real than it ever was, especially when you look at one of the unresolved points at the moment in the LAC, which is right at the tip at the Karakoram, which is close to the intersection of where the China-Pakistan border also is. I think I would say that India's military planners are genuinely concerned at the prospect of a two-front situation that they deal with, even if it's not, say, China, even if it's not direct Chinese involvement, say, in an India-Pakistan clash. It's a possibility that you have right now the infrastructure to mobilize resources, to mobilize assets. So I'd say definitely they are a part in the India-China equation right now more than ever before, because you've seen, I'd say you've seen a decisive Chinese slant towards Pakistan in the last 10 years, and that's backed up by the level of political, military, and economic investment there.
Fascinating. I mean, and then of course, the other dimension, which I'll now bring on one of the questions which has come in, was, you know, you talked in quite dark terms about the potential for conflict, and ultimately the three countries we're talking about here are all nuclear powered ones. So do you think we're talking about a situation which could escalate to that, a kind of a border clash of the kind that we saw in the Galwan Valley, becomes militarized, militarized with guns, because I think last time it was sticks and weapons, and then that escalates further to actually, you know, these two countries deploying their nuclear weapons as part of some sort of clash?
No, I don't think we're anywhere near that. I mean, I hope I didn't sort of scare people into raising that, but I don't think we're anywhere near that level of. I don't think we're anywhere near that level of thinking about that question. And what sort of concerns me is that even if you have a kind of brawl as you did with, say, sticks and iron pipes and rods, you actually had firing of warning shots in August 2020. You had tanks deployed within a few meters of each other. And you later had the former head of India's Northern Army Command. He actually said in an interview, which didn't get all that much attention, he said that they were a trigger away from firing of tanks. And he said that it took a lot of courage for the young men who were sitting in the tanks to not actually do that. So you were actually a hair's breadth away from firing of artillery. So in terms of that kind of limited conflict, I mean, I'd say that you'd be foolish to entirely rule it out given what happened less than 2 years ago. And given the fact that there's no agreement on de-escalation, I would change sort of my assessment of this, say, if India and China agreed to de-escalate, to de-induct their troops and to sort of dismantle their forward infrastructure. But I'd say that's highly unlikely given the way that I've seen even in the Chinese state media, constant emphasis right now of what they've been doing in forward areas. So I think that they've decided that this kind of new arrangement is here to stay, which is why I think it's significantly raised the risk of a confrontation.
Fascinating. No, I think the nuclear question is one has to ask in this sort of context, but it's I think you put it very appropriately. To maybe switch to a slightly less contentious space nonetheless, I'm sure, but less militarized space, let's say. If we look at kind of the China-India economic relationship, I think there's been a real push recently by Delhi in particular to try to curtail and control Chinese investment into India. And from what you were saying before, it sounds like in part that was triggered by, these border clashes that kind of led to deaths and change everyone's perceptions. I wonder if you could talk us through the economic consequences and how that relationship has shifted, the economic relationship between China and India, and whether you think we're going to move towards greater divergence or we'll continue to see some convergence. Because in some sectors, China has in the past been very heavily invested in India, and in what I suppose even more term sensitive sectors like, telecoms. So I wonder if you could talk us through the sort of economic side of things and how that's changed over time.
Right. It's actually interesting that it seems like a lifetime ago, but from the time the Modi government came to power in 2014, right up until 2020, they were really gung-ho and bullish on attracting investment from China. You would have people like Jack Ma actually on their visits to India, they would meet Modi and they would commit to big investments. And Alibaba and Tencent, I think they sort of acquired pretty big portfolios. Almost every big Indian e-commerce company has a significant stake from a Chinese company. But I think I think two things changed all of that. One is, of course, the dynamics of what happened on the border, but you also had internal dynamics within China, which all of you would be familiar of in terms of the tech crackdown and the like. So I think this sort of very powerful link, this new link, I think got disrupted much sooner than many people expected. I think people thought this could be a long kind of binding glue for the two economies. So the result of that is you don't really have deep, close linkages. What you do have is a huge trading relationship. China is still by far the biggest trading partner for India. And India is dependent on China for a huge range of goods and imports, and that's increased in the last 2 years of the pandemic. And in fact, India's dependencies have grown in new sectors, like in terms of medical supplies, for example. So you're in the situation where India is unable to diversify its sort of trade needs from China, but at the same time, this huge inflow of Chinese investment, which you saw over a 4 or 5 year period, has overnight come to a complete stop. And I think that the long-term effect of that is that it will completely reduce the likelihood of both sides looking. I think there was some hope, maybe naive hope, that these investment linkages would act as a kind of stabilizer effect when you have all these unsettled political problems. But I think, unfortunately, now you're in a situation where you don't have that, given what's happened on the political side of the relationship. You're right in pointing out that India previously allowed Chinese telecom companies to have a huge role in their rollout of 3G and 4G. But now they've taken a direct result of what happened in the border. They have banned Chinese companies from 5G. And that's just an example of how the atmosphere has changed so much in the last 4 or 5 years. And I find it difficult to see it going back to what it was. I think that's kind of out of the window right now. And it would be politically impossible as well, I think, for any Indian government to court Chinese investment in the way the Modi government did for that 5 year period after what's happened in the last 2 years.
I mean, has there been a kind of a flight of Chinese investment out of the country? Have they sort of disinvested? Because I suppose from a Chinese perspective, I could still see India being a very attractive proposition, huge population, growing, increasingly wealthy, a great opportunity to try to tap into. And, a lot of this sort of e-commerce stuff was, I think, targeted at that. Do you see that now being the investment pulling back, or is it just sort of stayed where it was and not grown any further?
I think a lot of it has stayed where it was, but where I've seen a big change is new plans for, say, manufacturing in India. Chinese automobile companies, Chinese solar, Chinese energy companies, infrastructure projects they wanted to do in India. You're absolutely right in the fact that a lot of people that I speak to in Beijing felt like this was the next big thing for them because they felt there was market saturation in China, and where else do they have a comparable market of that size? So whether it was in e-commerce or whether it was even in energy, and in India, of course, has huge infrastructure shortfalls. So it was a huge sort of opportunity for them. But from what I've heard in the last year and a half, speaking to folks that I know who've been sort of looked at building factories in India and the like, after the investment curbs that came in 2020, India has now become time mafan for them. So there's just too much trouble at every level, and so they're kind of looking at Southeast Asia and elsewhere, even Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, because you need so many approvals at the moment. And Chinese companies that are present in India have had a lot of scrutiny in the last few months from the tax authorities, including the big Chinese smartphone companies, which are still dominant in the Indian market. It's interesting, they've been kind of immune from kind of the downturn in political relationship. It seems that young people still want a good Xiaomi or Realme or OnePlus phone, regardless of where it comes from. They're still making a lot of money in India, but what has changed is there's lots of scrutiny, and they've been recently raided. Almost all the big Chinese telecom companies in the last 6 months have been raided and investigated and fined heavily and accused of irregularities. So I think the message from the Indian government is pretty clear that I think Chinese companies aren't welcome at the moment. And I think they've tried to signal, I think part of it is part of India signaling to China on the boundary, saying that you can't separate the two. The Chinese argument is that historically the boundary has been kept insulated from the rest of the relationship. But the Indian argument is, well, that was predicated on peace of the boundary. So I think that's another sort of stalemate right now, and where the relationship goes from here beyond the boundary. I think there's a very fundamental difference right now in how they look at managing the boundary and its impact on economic and other areas of cooperation. And I think one thing that where they kind of are still in touch is on the multilateral side. They still meet at like the SCO and the BRICS and the like. But I think even there, the scope for really doing something meaningful has drastically, I'd say, reduced because of the political troubles bilaterally.
Fascinating. There's two strands there I want to forgive me. I think first, you know, your brief point about Russia's about bilateral and the SEO and everything else. I'd be interested to talk about Russia. But before that, actually, I wanted to ask you the sort of converse of the question of Chinese investors seeing India as an opportunity. I'm sure Indian investors also China as an opportunity. And is that something that you've seen has kind of been chased out or been made harder since these border clashes?
One of the curious things, Raf, is that for the last 20 years of pushing, Indian companies actually have never really made inroads into China. So in that sense, actually, if China has some leverage over India in terms of India's dependence on imports, one big difference from, say, Western countries' relationship with China is that Indian companies really don't have this dependency on the China market. So in that sense, China doesn't have that kind of leverage. I think Indian IT and pharma companies have for the last 10, 15 years unsuccessfully tried to come into China, but they faced regulatory hurdles, which India has been raising time and again for the last 10 years. I've been reporting on this, I think, for 10 years and seen zero progress in terms of China allowing Indian IT companies, which have been successful everywhere else in the world, but here. And pharmaceuticals as well, where in China it's a huge issue. You have high drug prices, but they haven't allowed Indian pharma companies to come in. Just as an aside, there's a huge sort of side market here where pre-COVID, you would have Chinese big buying groups where, you know, people suffering from diseases would travel, say, groups of 30, 40 to India, buy medicines and come back to China. I knew people were doing this kind of business. So the fact that they never made these inroads into China, I think that it never allowed the space to create those kind of deep connections. And I can think of very few Indian companies, hardly a couple that are actually manufacturing in China. There are a couple of auto component companies that are doing that. But for the most part, it's a sourcing relationship. Indian companies come to China, buy, and take it back to India. There's very little permanent presence here and very little direct selling to the China market, which is slightly different from, I think, most Western countries' relationship with China.
Yeah, no, I think, you know, so I suppose in India, you don't have the same business constituency at home lobbying the government to try to sort of stabilize the relationship with China, wanting to be into that opportunity, which must change the dynamic internally substantially. The other strand I want to pick on your last comments, and then I see some more questions come in, and let me encourage our audience. If you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in, and I will put them to Ananth. I might merge them into other questions, but, you know, please feel free to put them in. That's what we've been doing so far. The other point I want to pick up was kind of your last comment, but one, where at the end you talked a bit about how China and India were still interacting in some of these international multilateral fora, like the SCO or BRICS is the other big one, or the Russia-India-China grouping, RIC. And that, of course, brings in another power, Russia, which has, you made a very interesting border comparison before between India and China, and, you know, how hard one border was to get close to and militarize, and the other one where, you know, sheep were sort of wandering happily back and forth across. I wonder, you know, could you talk us through, because India has a very interesting relationship with Russia, of course, and India has a very contentious relationship with China. And China has a very interesting and positive relationship with Russia, complicated, and clearly is a very complicated relationship with India. I wonder if you could talk us through that little dynamic, because one of the ideas which is occasionally floated is either the idea that, Russia could somehow broker something here between these two, or in some way, India, is trying to leverage Russia to protect itself from China. I wonder if you could talk us through that little trilateral dynamic, which I've always been very fascinated by and trying to understand better.
Well, I think it is a really fascinating dynamic, especially post February of this year, and looking at how India and China have reacted to what's happening in Ukraine. And both have, I think, till date, neither has, I think China's stance has got a lot more attention than India's, but India hasn't directly condemned Russia either. And you've had high-level visits from India, including a defense minister. And at the current ongoing Vostok exercises, you have both Indian and Chinese participation. But I think the striking thing is, I think different Russian officials have said at various levels that they want India and China to sort it out, but there's been no, I think, indication of them attempting to broker something. I think because I think they've correctly looked at the bilateral dynamic between India and China as being complicated enough. And I think little appetite for, on either side, to have any kind of involvement. Publicly, you have the Chinese say that they're more concerned with US involvement, given that India and the US have been having rare exercises in high altitude areas not far from the border. So I think the fact of a third party mediation or involvement is quite remote, even though, as you said, this dynamic is quite interesting, where India-Russia relations still remain very close. Long term, I think that's a question for India to address, where given that there seems to be such a close, deepening dynamic between China and Russia, and given that China has access to all of Russia's probably as advanced military platforms that Russia is offering to India, I think you have been seeing over the last few years the diversification of India's military defense imports away from Russia, and I think you'll see that trend changing. And I'm sure that the China-Russia dynamic is one among many factors driving that trend. So even if India and Russia remain strategically close, I think the fact that you're seeing this diversification gives you some sense of how that's changing, even though gradually.
Fascinating, yeah. And I mean, I think the other elements that which you sort of briefly touched is, of course, the US within this context, because the US, I think, has been very eager for India to take a more, confrontational perspective with Russia in particular in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine, and India's hesitated, and as you point out, has sort of continued its relationship. And I wonder if we could use that to kind of pivot into the wider, US-India relationship, and how that kind of fits into this equation of China and India in particular. I mean, India, of course, is a member of the Quad, has been for some time. Previously, it was often seen as one of the more lukewarm members in when people tried to talk about turning the Quad towards some sort of confrontation with China. India seems more engaged on that now. And I wonder if you could talk us through how the kind of US angle to the China-India border relationship, how that kind of plays out.
I think that I think you're right in characterizing India as in the past being perhaps the most lukewarm among the Quad in naming China. And I think you've had US officials subsequently say that the reason why China isn't mentioned in Quad statements, you don't see direct references to China, even though India-China relations are at the worst phase in 60 years, you still don't see Quad statements directly mention problems with China. And I think it's a correct assessment from India in the sense that they know that ultimately the land border situation they have with China is something that India is going to have to deal with on its own. I think that no one in Delhi is under any illusion that a lot of what the Quad is doing, and a lot of it is obviously in the maritime realm, that it's going to have a direct impact in, say, deterring China from what it's doing on the boundary. I don't think that's the case at all. And I think maybe some would argue that perhaps China's actions on the boundary might even be aimed at a kind of signaling to India to go slow. And I think that's a misreading by China in terms of it's had the opposite effect in the last 12 to 18 months, where I think China has given India very little incentive to go slow on these relationships. given that what they've done bilaterally. But I think that while I think India sees huge space for the Quad to do things in the region, I think that we also shouldn't sort of over-exaggerate its direct impact on, say, for example, the India-China boundary. I don't think anyone in Delhi is under that illusion, nor do I think that I don't see any evidence or indication so far that anything that they're doing so far, at least, could be described as, say, aimed at containing China, which is how it's described by Chinese officials. I think some of the things they've been doing, such as, even though slow to take off their kind of vaccine initiative or cooperating on the economic side, I think a lot of it would be welcomed in, say, in Southeast Asia, where I think that there were people who were somewhat lukewarm to the Quad's focus on security issues, and they were saying, they want a credible economic alternative or option to China. So I think you're seeing this shift in the Quad as well. It's not just about sailing ships together. It's about doing all of these other things. And I don't think all of it's necessarily aimed at China. I'm not being diplomatic here, but just my sense of my reading of the kind of initiatives that they're speaking about at the moment, like vaccines and the economic side.
No, thank you. Very interesting. Of course, you're not a diplomat, so you don't need to worry about that. You're an analyst who observes these situations and offers excellent critiques and thoughts upon them. There's a few disparate areas I kind of still want to pick up on. And I think we've got about 10 minutes left. And again, let me encourage anyone who does have any outstanding questions to please put them into the Q&A function, and I will do my best to put them to you. But in the meantime, Ananth, forgive me if you suddenly get a whole volley of slightly random questions, but the kind of issues I've been thinking about trying to pull in, but I haven't quite gotten around to. So I'll just sort of put them to you in a slightly random order. Maybe I'll start by keeping on the theme of kind of, the US and maritime. And, there were some interesting comments recently around Taiwan from Delhi. And I think it seemed to be something of a change. And I wonder if you could talk us through a little bit how Taiwan has sort of figured into the China-India relationship.
I think that so far I wouldn't say that Taiwan has become a significant enough issue in the India-China relationship, or for that matter, that there's a significant change in India's approach to Taiwan. India still follows a one China policy, doesn't publicly reiterate it. It hasn't done so for the last 12 years, I think in part as a response to what China has been doing in Kashmir. Even though India doesn't publicly express support for a one China policy, I think practically nothing really has changed in terms of, say, the level of India's political relations with Taiwan. I think it remains as it was. So I wouldn't read too much into that. I still am sort of not quite sure. I did report on the fact that there was a statement from strangely enough, from India's High Commissioner in Sri Lanka, which referred in response to something that the Chinese ambassador there said. There was this diplomatic spat over the visit of a Chinese spy ship, a satellite tracking vessel to Sri Lanka. So India had referred to the militarization of the strait. I still don't think it was a policy change. I think it might have been maybe not a precisely worded kind of statement. It might have been as simple as that. I think that you've seen India not take positions on Taiwan, even Xinjiang, no statements yet on Xinjiang or Hong Kong. And the reasoning that I've heard from Indian officials is that they feel their plate with China is full as is. I don't know if you will see a change in that going forward. But I suspect there's also an element of, say, we'll open up China and say, commenting on India's internal matters. And I think both of them have kind of, there's also a weird commonality here where both India and China, sort of bristle very easily at what they see as anyone commenting on their internal situations. And I think that kind of dynamic in the relationship has been there for quite a long time. And I don't see that changing in a big way. But having said that, I do think that what the Taiwan crisis has done is I think that India sees a little bit of an opportunity in, say, for example, there's been recent conversations had with Taiwan about Taiwanese semiconductor companies coming to India and setting up a base there, doing more things economically. I think that they're also looking at, say, education, where India has now been slowly discouraging students from going to China. And I think that they see that to do more with Taiwan on non-political things, economically, on the education side, And I think that you'll see much more interest in that going forward. So I would say there has been a shift that's worth paying attention to, especially when it comes to what's happening on the economic front between India and Taiwan. But I don't think that in any way kind of reflects a big sort of political change in how India is dealing with Taiwan. I don't, given the fact that you have so many bilateral issues between India and China, it's probably unlikely that they would revisit that in a big way.
Right. Yeah. Don't need another field of conflict if you've got some pretty active ones already. To pick up on another disparate question to say is to consider Pakistan. Now we touched upon Pakistan a little bit briefly within the kind of Borderlands context, and it was very interesting what you were saying there about that really getting brought into the conflict. But I wonder if we could, if you give us your thoughts on kind of the current state of the China-Pakistan bilateral relationship, which I think, has its sort of ups and downs. And, Shahbaz Sharif, I think was, I think, as far as I understood, Beijing seemed quite happy that he comes in about. But how do you think that's actually played out? And how do you think relations are going between the two of them at the moment? And whether that plays into the kind of China-India dynamic as well?
Yeah, I think that for sure on the economic side, there are lots of problems. I think sometimes they kind of overstate the level of economic engagement that they have. I think it's usually ends up being less than advertised in terms of how much investment from China actually goes into Pakistan. But having said that, I would still say that even though you have hiccups from time to time, say on Chinese projects going slow, on the safety of Chinese citizens in Pakistan, every few months you have maybe an attack or a serious security situation. I still feel that the broad dynamic in terms of this incredibly close strategic relationship, this incredibly close military relationship, that I just don't see that changing. And I think that in some ways, I think you could argue it's China's closest relationship with any country. There's far more going on with Pakistan than with North Korea, for example. It's a relationship that China has invested so much in. I think in the Xi Jinping period, I've seen that really take on and it's come to an entirely different level in the kind of engagement and interactions that I see pre-COVID. You have Pakistani delegations here all the time in Beijing. And I think that they see this as a unique relationship, and they started speaking of it as a model for relationship, or as a model relationship for any sort of engagement between countries. So I put it in a kind of league of its own. And even though you have economic hiccups and issues over debt and a few Chinese projects that aren't working out, I think that broad dynamic won't change because both of them see so much value in the other.
Fascinating. That's really interesting. I thought an interesting twist to it recently was the US selling a whole bunch of fighter jets to the Pakistanis, which I'm sure would have agitated people in both Delhi and Beijing at the same time. But the other sort of final question maybe I'll put to you, which veers beyond our kind of borderland questions, but you are a well-regarded and well-connected correspondent sitting in Beijing. So given the timings, it would be remiss to not ask us, to not take advantage of the opportunity to ask you. So, we have the big party Congress coming up next month. And, what do you think it actually is going to mean for Xi Jinping? And, do you have a sense of what is going to happen? And do you have any sense of what the Politburo might look like? I mean, would you venture to make any predictions? I'm sure your colleagues at your news desk in Delhi are asking you regularly for this. Do you have a sense you can give us of where you think things are going and what Xi is planning?
Leaving aside my guesses for the next Politburo Standing Committee, I will say this honestly, I have zero insight into who may or may not make the Politburo Standing Committee. The one thing that I want to say is I was here covering the 18th Party Congress in 2012, and the one thing that if I had to sort of say is I'm just so struck by the different mood from 2012 to 2022. 2012, there was a sense of optimism. I think there was a genuine sense of sort of pride in where China was going. And I think that I can't stress enough how downbeat things are at the moment in terms of the way the economy is struggling, the way zero COVID. I'm not saying there's universal opposition to zero COVID. I think it's a lot more complicated than how it might be seen abroad, given that it's worked in some cities. I think I see a huge sort of regional differences. If you've gone through what, say, a Shanghai or Xi'an has gone through, you'll have a different view than, say, Changsha or Beijing. But having said that, given the economic sentiment, the whole picture seems so downbeat now from last 10 years, from 10 years ago when I was covering the 18th Congress. And the strange irony is, even though the party is kind of in its own bubble, preparing for this big celebration, this whole month of festivities, for the guy on the street, I think it's just a sense of hoping it gets over soon, and there's some big, there's a reevaluation of how they're handling the pandemic. I think most people that I speak to in the business community in China feel this is extremely unsustainable. Change can't come soon enough, and I've just been here for the last 2-3 months since I was waiting for a visa for the longest time. But it just struck me in terms of the mood is so strikingly different from the Congress in 2012. I'd say in terms of the final point that I would say is, I think maybe there's been a little bit of media coverage in terms of, say, an opposition to Xi, et cetera, et cetera. I think some of that's overblown. Everything that I see, it seems that it's a done deal. But at the same time, if we never know, given that you can't do polling here, but I'd say that if you look at public impression and perceptions and sentiment, it's such a sea change from 10 years ago.
Fascinating. Well, I mean, a downbeat a way to end what has been a really fascinating discussion and really interesting set of insights into India's borderland relations or China's borderland relations with India. You've really taken us across the whole wide gamut of issues, which is very much what we were hoping to cover. So thank you again very much for taking the time to do this, Ananth. And, let me encourage all of our audience, who are still here and those who are listening subsequently on podcasts and, who watch the video subsequently, to really encourage you to go out and get the book, India's China Challenge, which will be more of is a lot about this and even more. And then also another very interesting book, which Ananth and another colleague wrote recently, looking at China's relationship with Afghanistan, which is also a fascinating set of insights and relationships there. So thank you very much, Ananth, for taking the time to do this. I think we can all wish you good luck in Beijing, and I hope that everything stables out, and I hope that the Congress turns out to be an interesting show to report, and we very much look forward to reading your reporting from that. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. To those of you listening, if you do not know about Young China Watchers, please do sign up to our website, where you can get our newsletter, you can get our pulse survey, you can get podcasts, videos, and all the other material that's put out on our blog and other places, and you can connect with the global community of Young China Watchers. We've got 10 chapters around the world, 3 in North America, 3 in Europe, and the last 4 are all out here in Asia. So look online, you might be able to find one that's near you. You can go participate in the events in person. And Ananth, thank you very much, and I hope you're able to connect with our colleagues in Beijing at some point when things become a little easier to move around. So thank you very much for taking the time to do this. We'll leave you to your night in Beijing, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in from around the world.